At my daughter's wedding, they sat me next to the bathroom. Her stepfather gave a toast. Today my daughter is getting married, and it's an honor to be the father you never had. 200 guests laughed and looked at me. Then one of them pointed his finger and shouted, "He's a billionaire!" I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I pulled into the parking lot of the Grandview Country Club, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. 25 years. That's how long it had been since I last saw my daughter Emma walk down an aisle, and back then it was at her high school graduation. Now she was getting married, and I was here as little more than a reluctant obligation. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, cream-colored cardstock with elegant gold lettering. Mr. David Reynolds, it read, formal and distant. No Dad. No personal note, just my name printed in the same impersonal font as every other guest. I should have known then what kind of reception awaited me. I straightened my tie in the rearview mirror, the same navy blue one I'd worn to every important business meeting for the past decade. At 59, I'd learned to armor myself in the trappings of success, even when walking into situations where none of it seemed to matter. My reflection looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. Inside the country club, the grandeur was unmistakable. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and fresh white roses adorned every surface. This was the kind of wedding that cost more than most people's houses. I found myself automatically calculating the expenses as I walked through the foyer. The flowers alone had to be $15,000. The venue rental probably another $20,000. Someone had spared no expense for my daughter's special day. "Excuse me, are you David Reynolds?" A young woman with a clipboard approached me, her smile polite but distant. "Yes, that's me." She consulted her list, her finger tracing down the page. "Table 12, she said, handing me a small card with my name on it. I followed her directions through the main ballroom, past tables adorned with crystal and silver, past the elegant dance floor where my daughter would soon share her first dance as a married woman. Table 12 was tucked away in a corner, right next to the restroom doors. The constant sound of people coming and going, the occasional flush of toilets, the hand dryers whirring to life every few minutes. The message was clear. I sat down heavily in my assigned chair, looking around at my table mates, an elderly couple I didn't recognize, a single woman scrolling through her phone, and 3 empty chairs. Even at the table of misfits, I seemed to be among the least welcome. The ceremony was beautiful. Emma looked radiant in her white gown, her hair swept up in an elaborate style that reminded me of her mother at that age. When she walked down the aisle on Marcus's arm, my heart clenched. Marcus, the man who had been her stepfather for 20 years, the man who had filled the role I should have played. He beamed with pride as he gave her away, and I watched from my distant seat, feeling like a stranger at my own daughter's wedding. The reception began with the usual fanfare. The happy couple made their grand entrance, and I clapped along with everyone else, my hands moving mechanically while my mind wandered to all the milestones I'd missed. Her first day of school, her first heartbreak, her college graduation. I'd tried to be there for all of them, but somehow my presence was always unwelcome, my attempts at connection politely rebuffed. Then came the speeches. Marcus rose from the head table, champagne flute in hand, his face glowing with paternal pride. The room fell silent as he began to speak. 25 years ago, I was blessed to marry not just the love of my life, but to become father to the most incredible little girl in the world. His voice carried easily across the ballroom, confident and warm. Today, I have the honor of watching that little girl become a beautiful woman and start her own family. I felt my chest tighten. This was supposed to be a joyful moment, but each word felt like a small knife being twisted deeper into an old wound. "Emma," Marcus continued, raising his glass toward the head table, "you have brought nothing but joy into my life from the very first day. I am so proud to be the father you never had, to have been there for every important moment, every triumph, every challenge. The father you never had." The words hit me like a physical blow. 200 guests raised their glasses in agreement, their murmurs of approval washing over me like a tide. I looked around the room and saw knowing glances, pitying looks in my direction. They all knew the story, or at least the version of it that had been carefully crafted over the years. David Reynolds, the absent father, the man who walked away from his responsibilities. An older man at table 6 actually pointed at me and stage whispered to his companion, "That's him, the biological father. Poor guy." His voice carried farther than he intended, and several people turned to look at me with barely concealed curiosity. I sat there, my untouched champagne growing warm in my hand, feeling smaller with each passing second. The laughter and applause seemed to echo endlessly in my ears. Marcus continued his speech, talking about being there for Emma's dance recitals, her soccer games, her high school graduation. All the moments I had tried desperately to attend, only to be told I wasn't welcome, that my presence would upset her, that it was better if I stayed away. The worst part wasn't the public humiliation, though that stung deeply enough. The worst part was seeing Emma's face as she listened to Marcus's words. She was radiant, genuinely happy, nodding along with every word he said. In her eyes, this man truly was her father. I was just the stranger in the corner, the uncomfortable reminder of a past she'd rather forget. When the speech ended and the applause died down, I excused myself from the table and stepped outside onto the country club's terrace. The evening air was cool against my flushed face, and I took several deep breaths, trying to regain my composure. 25 years of this. 25 years of being painted as the villain in my own daughter's story. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over Emma's contact information. What would I even say? "Congratulations on your wedding. Sorry for being the father you never had." The irony was suffocating. I had spent the last quarter-century building something meaningful, creating a legacy worth leaving behind, and none of it mattered here. In this room full of people celebrating my daughter's happiness, I was nothing more than an unwelcome ghost from her past. As I stood there on that terrace, watching the last light fade from the sky, I realized that tomorrow I would wake up and return to my life, my business, my carefully constructed world where my worth wasn't measured by a 20-year-old narrative I'd never been allowed to correct. But tonight I was just a man who had lost his daughter long ago and was finally understanding that some losses are permanent. Driving home from the wedding, my mind drifted back to where it all began. Emma was 5 years old when Patricia decided I wasn't enough anymore. 5 years old with pigtails and gap-toothed smiles, still calling me daddy and running to the door when I came home from work. I remember the night Patricia asked for the divorce like it was yesterday. We were sitting in our small kitchen in the house on Maple Street, the one with the squeaky front step that I'd been meaning to fix. Emma was asleep upstairs, probably clutching her stuffed elephant Mr. Peanuts, the one I'd bought her at the zoo the week before. "I can't do this anymore, David," Patricia had said, her voice calm in that terrifying way that meant she'd already made up her mind. "You're never here. You're always working, always trying to prove something. Emma needs stability." I'd been working 2 jobs then, trying to build something better for our family. Days at the accounting firm, nights doing freelance bookkeeping for small businesses. I thought I was being responsible, being the provider my own father never was. What I didn't realize was that Patricia had been spending her lonely evenings with Marcus, her supervisor at the real estate office where she worked part-time. "We can work this out," I'd pleaded. "I'll cut back on the freelance work. We'll make more time for family dinners, weekend trips." But she was already shaking her head. "It's too late for that. I found someone who can give Emma what she needs. Someone established, someone reliable, someone reliable." Marcus was 15 years older than me, owned a successful property management company, and had the kind of settled confidence that came with having already made it in life. I was 29, still scrambling to make ends meet, still believing that hard work alone would be enough to build the life I wanted for my family. The custody battle was swift and brutal. Patricia's lawyer painted me as an absent workaholic, someone too obsessed with money to be a proper father. My lawyer, a kind man I could barely afford, did his best. But the evidence seemed stacked against me. I was working 80 hours a week. I had missed some of Emma's bedtime stories. I had been late to one parent-teacher conference because of a client emergency. Marcus, meanwhile, had already started stepping into the father role. He attended Emma's dance recitals, took her to the park, was there for the daily routines that my work schedule had forced me to miss. By the time the divorce was finalized, the narrative was already set. I was the father who had chosen work over family. He was the man who stepped up to fill the void I'd created. The court awarded Patricia primary custody, and I got every other weekend and one evening during the week. It should have been the beginning of building a new relationship with my daughter, but Patricia made sure that never happened. The first few months, Emma still lit up when she saw me. We'd go to parks and ice cream shops, and she'd tell me about her week, about the stories Marcus read to her, about the new room he'd helped her decorate. I smiled and listened, dying a little inside each time she mentioned him. but grateful for any time I could get with her. Then the cancellations started. Emma has a fever, Patricia would call on Friday afternoons. Maybe next weekend. She's got a birthday party this weekend. I forgot to mention it during our call yesterday. Emma says she doesn't want to come this weekend. She wants to stay home with Marcus and work on a school project. Each excuse felt reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern. I'd show up to pick up Emma, and she'd be standing behind Patricia's legs, suddenly shy, suddenly reluctant. I'd crouch down to her level, trying to make myself less intimidating, trying to coax a smile from the little girl who used to run into my arms. "We don't have to do anything special," I'd tell her. "We could just watch movies and make popcorn." But Patricia would place a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "Maybe she's just not ready today, David. You know how children can be when they're adjusting to change." The worst part was that Patricia was never cruel about it. She was always reasonable, always concerned about Emma's emotional well-being, always suggesting that perhaps I was pushing too hard, expecting too much too soon. To any outside observer, she looked like a caring mother protecting her child from unnecessary stress. I tried everything to maintain the connection. I sent letters, one every week, telling Emma about my day, asking about hers, sharing little jokes and drawings. I never received replies, and when I asked about them during our rare phone calls, Emma would say she never got them. Later, I'd learned that Patricia had been intercepting them, claiming she was protecting Emma from my manipulation attempts. I bought presents for every birthday, every Christmas, every little milestone I could think of. A bicycle with training wheels when she turned 6. A dollhouse when she told me during one awkward phone call that she wanted to be an architect. Books, art supplies, a tiny jewelry box with a ballerina that spun when you opened it. All of them returned unopened, with notes explaining that Emma had moved on and didn't need reminders of the past. By the time Emma turned 8, our conversations had dwindled to stilted monthly phone calls where she answered my questions in one-word responses and seemed eager to hang up. Patricia would hover in the background, and I could hear her gentle prompts. "Tell Daddy about school, sweetie," always said in a tone that suggested she was being generous in allowing even this minimal contact. The final blow came when Emma was 10. I'd been calling on her birthday every year, but that year the phone rang and rang with no answer. When I finally reached Patricia the next day, she sounded tired, almost sympathetic. "David, I think it's time we had an honest conversation. Emma is old enough now to make her own choices about contact. She's asked me several times why you keep calling when you never wanted to be her father in the first place." "That's not true," I'd said, my voice breaking. "I've always wanted to be her father. I've never stopped wanting that." "I know you believe that," Patricia replied, "but your actions spoke louder than your words. You chose work over family, and now Emma has a father who chooses her every day. Marcus has been there for everything that mattered. He's earned the right to be called Dad." The phone call stopped after that. I'd tried calling a few more times, but Emma's voice had grown increasingly distant, increasingly uncomfortable. The last time we spoke, when she was 12, she'd asked me directly, "Why do you keep calling me? Marcus is my dad now." I'd sat in my car after that call, crying harder than I had since my own father's funeral. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that you've been fighting for her for 7 years? How do you compete with the man who's been there for every soccer practice while you were working 16-hour days to pay child support and try to build something stable enough to convince a court that you deserved more time with your daughter? So I stopped calling. Not because I stopped caring, but because I realized that my love for Emma had to include letting her be happy, even if that happiness didn't include me. Marcus was a good man, and he clearly loved her. Patricia, whatever her faults, was a devoted mother. Emma was thriving in a stable home with 2 parents who could give her everything I couldn't. But I never stopped hoping that someday, when she was older, she might want to know my side of the story. Someday, I thought, when she has children of her own, she'll understand what it means to love someone more than your own life. And maybe then she'll wonder about the father who never stopped fighting for her, even when fighting meant walking away. 3 days after the wedding, I sat in my corner office on the 23rd floor of the Reynolds building, staring at a stack of invoices that had arrived in my morning mail. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd named the building after myself, yet my own daughter didn't even know I owned it. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across my mahogany desk as I opened the first envelope. Grandview Country Club, catering services for the Henderson Wright wedding. $47,800. My breath caught in my throat. Henderson was Emma's married name now. I'd paid for my own humiliation. I opened the next invoice with trembling fingers. Metropolitan Florists. Event arrangement for private celebration. $15,200. The same flowers that had adorned the tables where I'd sat in exile, breathing in their expensive fragrance while my daughter celebrated with the man she called father. One by one, I went through the stack. The wedding photographer, someone I'd hired through my event management subsidiary without knowing whose wedding he'd be capturing. The limousine service that had transported the bridal party, owned by a company I'd acquired 2 years earlier. The string quartet that had played during the ceremony, booked through an entertainment agency I held a majority stake in. For 25 years, I'd been building an empire. What started as a desperate attempt to prove my worth after the divorce had grown into something I never could have imagined. Reynolds Holdings controlled 17 different companies across the events industry, hospitality, and luxury services. I hadn't set out to corner the market on making rich people's dreams come true, but that's exactly what had happened. The calculating part of my mind that had built this empire began adding up the numbers. The venue rental, the catering, the flowers, the entertainment, the transportation, the photography, even the champagne that had been served during the toast that destroyed me. Conservatively, I had personally funded at least 60% of Emma's wedding through my various business interests. I reached for my phone and called Janet, my executive assistant who'd been with me for 12 years. "Janet, I need you to pull the client files for the Henderson Wright wedding from last weekend. Every vendor, every service, every detail." "Of course, Mr. Reynolds. Should I send them to your office?" "Yes, and Janet." I paused, the words sticking in my throat. That was my daughter's wedding. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. Janet had been with me long enough to know the bare bones of my story, the carefully edited version I'd shared during late nights when the loneliness became too heavy to carry alone. "Oh, David," she said softly, dropping the formal tone we maintained during business hours. "I had no idea." Neither did I until now. Within an hour, Janet had compiled a comprehensive file that painted a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to see. Patricia had planned every detail of this wedding through vendors that ultimately answered to me. The wedding planner who'd arranged the embarrassing seating chart worked for Prestige Events, a company I'd acquired 5 years earlier. The sommelier who'd selected the wines that had been poured during Marcus's speech was employed by Cork and Crown, my specialty beverage consultancy. Most crushing of all was the discovery that Patricia had negotiated payment plans with several vendors, arrangements that were only possible because my companies had specific policies about working with established clients who had long-term relationships with our services. She'd been planning this wedding for over a year, and every luxury, every perfect detail, had been subsidized by the father of the bride she'd worked so hard to erase. I found myself laughing, a bitter sound that echoed strangely in my empty office. The cosmic joke was too perfect. I'd spent 2.5 decades building a business empire motivated by the need to prove I could provide for my family, and I'd ended up providing for them anyway, just without any recognition or gratitude. My computer chimed with an email notification. A thank you note from the wedding planner, praising the seamless coordination between all the Reynolds Holdings vendors and expressing hope for future collaborations with the Henderson family for upcoming events. She mentioned that Mrs. Henderson had been particularly pleased with the level of service and was already discussing plans for a vow renewal ceremony in 5 years. 5 years. Emma was already planning to renew her vows, and undoubtedly I would be funding that celebration too, sitting at another table near the bathrooms while Marcus gave another speech about being the father she never had. I pulled up the financial records for Patricia's household, something I could access through the property management arm of my business. Marcus's company, Hartwell Properties, had been one of my first acquisitions 15 years ago. He'd been struggling with cash flow, facing potential bankruptcy, when I'd offered to buy him out. He'd stayed on as the regional manager, never knowing that his comfortable salary and benefits package came courtesy of the man whose family he'd taken over. The house where Emma had grown up, the one Patricia still lived in with Marcus. The mortgage had been refinanced 3 times in the past decade, each time through Cornerstone Lending, another subsidiary I'd purchased during the real estate boom. Their interest rates had been remarkably favorable, something Patricia probably attributed to Marcus's connections in the real estate industry, rather than the reality that her ex-husband had been quietly ensuring their financial stability for years. Emma's college tuition at Northwestern, $130,000 over 4 years, had been paid through a series of convenient scholarships and grants administered by the Reynolds Foundation, my charitable arm that funded educational opportunities for deserving students. The selection committee had no idea they were awarding money to my own daughter, and Patricia had never questioned why Emma seemed to qualify for every financial aid program she applied for. Even the engagement ring Emma wore, a 2-carat diamond in a platinum setting, had been purchased from Brilliance & Co., from the jewelry store I'd bought 3 years earlier when the original owner wanted to retire. The 20% family discount Marcus had received was actually company policy for all employees of Reynolds Holdings subsidiaries. I'd been the ghost in their financial machine for years, ensuring their comfort and security while remaining completely invisible to them. Every major expense, every little luxury, every moment of stability they'd enjoyed had been possible because the man they'd dismissed as an absent father had spent 25 years making sure they never had to worry about money. The most painful irony was that I'd done it all unconsciously. These weren't calculated acts of secret generosity. They were simply the natural result of building a business empire in the same city where my daughter lived. I'd bought companies that served people like Patricia and Marcus, people with taste and money and social standing, never realizing that I was creating a web that would eventually ensnare my own family. As I sat there surrounded by invoices and contracts and financial records, I realized that I held more power over Emma's world than Marcus ever had. With a few phone calls, I could make their comfortable life significantly less comfortable. I could call in loans, terminate vendor relationships, adjust interest rates, cancel their membership to the country club where they'd spent their weekends for the past decade. But what would be the point? Emma was happy. She'd built a life with the man she considered her real father, and destroying that wouldn't bring her back to me. It would only prove what Patricia had always said about me, that I was the kind of man who put money above family, who used financial leverage to get what he wanted. No, I realized as I closed the files and locked them away in my desk drawer. Some secrets were meant to stay buried. Emma would never know that her fairy tale wedding had been a gift from the father she'd forgotten, and maybe that was exactly how it should be. After all, the best fathers give their children what they need, even when those children don't know they need it, even when there's no possibility of recognition or gratitude, even when it breaks your heart to do it. Emma stared at the box in her hands, her heart pounding as she recognized her own name written in faded ink across the top. She'd been cleaning out her mother's attic, helping Patricia prepare for the move to the smaller condo that she and Marcus had decided to downsize to, now that Emma was married and out of the house. "What's in here, Mom?" Emma called down from the attic ladder. "Oh, just old papers and things." Patricia's voice drifted up from the kitchen. Most of it can probably be thrown away. But Emma couldn't bring herself to throw away a box with her name on it. Especially not when she recognized the handwriting as her father's, the same careful script she remembered from the few birthday cards she'd received before he'd stopped trying to contact her. She carried the box down to her childhood bedroom and sat cross-legged on the carpet, the same pink shag rug she'd picked out when she was 7. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, each envelope addressed to Miss Emma Reynolds in that familiar handwriting. Her maiden name. She'd been Emma Henderson since she was 10, when Marcus had officially adopted her, but these letters were addressed to the little girl she'd been before that happened. With shaking fingers, she untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The date in the corner read, September 15th, nearly 20 years ago. "Dear Emma," it began, "today is your first day of 3rd grade. I hope you had a wonderful morning and that your new teacher is kind to you. I remember how nervous you used to get on the first day of school, how you'd make me practice walking you to your classroom the week before. I hope Marcus walked you today and that you felt brave and excited instead of scared." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had no memory of being nervous about school or of her father practicing anything with her. But as she read on, fragments of memories began to surface, hazy and uncertain, like looking at old photographs through frosted glass. "I drove by Roosevelt Elementary this morning just to see the building where you're spending your days. I know I can't be there to walk you to class anymore, but I want you to know that I'm thinking about you every morning when you wake up and every afternoon when you come home. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, which is what I used to tell you when I tucked you in at night. Do you remember? She did remember. Suddenly, vividly, she remembered a tall man with gentle hands lifting her into a bed with yellow sheets, pointing out the window at the night sky and counting stars with her until she fell asleep. The memory was so clear it took her breath away. Emma opened the second letter, then the third, then the fourth. Letter after letter, one for every week, sometimes 2 or 3 when something special had happened. Her father had been writing to her constantly, documenting his own life while asking about hers, sharing memories she'd forgotten and creating new ones she'd never received. Dear Emma, I saw that Roosevelt Elementary is having their spring carnival next weekend. I remember how much you loved the ring toss game last year, and how proud you were when you won that stuffed giraffe. I hope you have fun this year, and I hope someone takes pictures so you can remember how happy you looked. Emma put the letter down and rushed to her old dresser, pulling out photo albums until she found the right one. There, on page 12, was a picture of her at 8 years old, grinning widely while holding a stuffed giraffe nearly as tall as she was. She'd completely forgotten about that carnival, about that prize, about how proud she'd felt carrying that giraffe around for weeks afterward, but her father had remembered. She returned to the box with trembling hands, finding not just letters but copies of report cards she'd never known he'd received, newspaper clippings of her school plays and soccer games, even a program from her high school graduation with her name highlighted in yellow marker. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, she found the presents, the bicycle she'd always wondered about, the one that had appeared in the garage when she was 6 with a note saying it was from Santa even though Christmas was still months away. The dollhouse she'd treasured throughout elementary school, the one Patricia had said came from a garage sale, but which looked too perfect, too new. The jewelry box with the spinning ballerina, the one that had played Für Elise and which she'd danced to every night before bed. All of them had small cards tucked inside, cards in her father's handwriting. Happy birthday, Emma. I hope you love your new bike as much as I loved picking it out for you. For my little architect, who's going to build castles that reach the clouds. Every little girl deserves to dance like a ballerina, especially one as graceful as you. Emma sank onto her bed, surrounded by 20 years of love she'd never known existed. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He'd been there constantly, persistently, sending tokens of his affection that had somehow made their way to her anyway, filtered through her mother's careful curation. She picked up her phone and called Patricia. Mom, I found a box in the attic. A box of letters from my father. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Emma wondered if the call had dropped. Emma, honey, I can explain. Can you? Can you explain why you told me he never tried to contact me when there are hundreds of letters here? Can you explain why you told me he didn't care about me when he was writing to me every week for years? It's complicated, sweetheart. You were so young, and he had hurt us so badly. I was trying to protect you. Protect me from what? From knowing that my father loved me? Emma could hear Patricia crying on the other end of the line, but she found she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was angry with her mother, really angry. I have to go, Mom. I need to think about this. She hung up and immediately called her husband, Michael, who was at work finishing up a late meeting. Mike, I need you to come home. I found something, and I don't know what to do with it. An hour later, Michael sat beside her on their bed while she showed him letter after letter, present after present. Evidence of a father's love that had been hidden from her for 2 decades. Emma, Michael said softly, his arm around her shoulders, your father never stopped loving you. But why didn't Mom tell me? Why did she keep all of this from me? Michael was quiet for a long moment. He'd always been the thoughtful one in their relationship, the one who considered all angles before speaking. Maybe she thought she was doing the right thing at the time. Divorce is hard on everyone, especially children. Maybe she thought it would be easier for you to bond with Marcus if you didn't have divided loyalties. But these aren't just cards and letters, Mike. Look at this. Emma pulled out a folder she'd found near the bottom of the box. Bank statements. He was sending money every month, way more than he was required to. College fund contributions, emergency fund deposits. Mom told me Marcus paid for my college, but look at these dates. The money was coming from my father. Emma's voice broke as the full scope of the deception became clear. Everything I thought I knew about my childhood is wrong. Every story Mom told me about him abandoning us, about him choosing work over family, about him not caring enough to fight for me. It was all lies. She picked up one of the last letters in the bundle, dated just a few months before her 18th birthday. Dear Emma, tomorrow you graduate from high school, and I am so proud of the young woman you've become. I know you don't know me anymore, and I know you've found happiness with the family you've chosen. But I want you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you, that I haven't wondered what you're learning, what you're dreaming about, what makes you laugh. I hope Northwestern treats you well, and I hope you find everything you're looking for there. I love you today and always, Dad. Mike. He knew where I was going to college. He knew everything about my life, even though I never spoke to him. Michael took the letter gently from her hands and read it himself. When he looked up, his eyes were sad. Emma, I think you need to call him. I don't even know his number. I don't know where he lives, or what he does for work, or if he's married, or if he even wants to hear from me after all these years. But you want to find out? Emma looked around at the evidence of her father's love scattered across her bedroom. 20 years of devotion she'd never known existed. For the first time since she was 5 years old, she wanted her daddy. Yes, she whispered, I want to find out. Finding my father's contact information turned out to be easier than I'd expected. A simple internet search revealed Reynolds Holdings, with David Reynolds listed as chief executive officer. The same man who used to read me bedtime stories about princesses and dragons now owned a building downtown with his name on it. I stared at the corporate website for an hour, studying the professional headshot of a man I barely recognized. He was older, obviously, his dark hair now silver at the temples, but his eyes were the same. Kind eyes, the same ones that had looked at me with such love in those distant memories that were slowly coming back to life. The next morning I called his office. Reynolds Holdings, this is Janet speaking. Hi, I'd like to speak with David Reynolds, please. May I ask who's calling? I hesitated, my heart pounding. Emma Henderson. It's personal. There was a pause, then Janet's voice came back, softer this time. Please hold, Mrs. Henderson. The wait felt eternal. I had rehearsed what I would say, but every word fled from my mind as I listened to the classical music playing through the phone. What do you say to a father you haven't spoken to in 20 years? How do you apologize for a lifetime of believing lies? Emma? His voice was exactly as I remembered, warm and gentle, with a slight tremor that told me he was as nervous as I was. Hi, Dad. The word felt strange on my tongue, foreign after so many years of calling Marcus Dad, but also right in a way that surprised me. Emma, I can't believe you called. Are you okay? Is everything all right? Even now, his first concern was for my well-being. After 20 years of silence, after being excluded from my wedding, after being humiliated in front of 200 strangers, his immediate response was to worry about me. I found the letters, Dad. I found all of them. The silence on the other end stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. You found them, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Every single one. 20 years worth. And the presents, and the bank statements, and the college fund contributions. My voice broke. Why didn't you tell me at the wedding? Why didn't you say something when Marcus was giving that speech? What could I have said, Emma? It was your wedding day. You were happy. You looked so beautiful, so radiant. I wasn't going to ruin that by airing old grievances. But it wasn't just old grievances, was it? You've been taking care of me my whole life, and I never knew. Another long pause. You weren't supposed to know. That wasn't the point. Can I see you? Can we talk in person? Of course. Yes, of course. Would you like to come to my office, or would you prefer somewhere more private? Your office is fine. I want to see what you've built. 2 hours later, I stood in the marble lobby of the Reynolds building, craning my neck to look up at the soaring ceiling. The security guard directed me to the executive elevator, and as I rode up to the 23rd floor, I tried to process the fact that my father owned all of this. Janet greeted me at the reception desk with a warm smile. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Mrs. Henderson, it's such a pleasure to meet you. Your father talks about you all the time. He does? Oh yes, he's so proud of you. Your graduation from Northwestern, your job at the marketing firm, your wedding. He knows more about your life than you might think. She led me down a hallway lined with awards and photographs, past a conference room where several people in business suits were having an animated discussion, to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. My father stood when I walked in, and for a moment we just looked at each other. He was taller than I remembered, broader in the shoulders, but his presence felt exactly the same. Safe, protective, like coming home. "Emma," he said softly, and then I was crossing the room and hugging him, really hugging him, for the first time in 25 years. He smelled like expensive cologne and coffee, but underneath that was something familiar, something that brought back memories of being small and safe and loved unconditionally. When we finally pulled apart, we were both crying. "I'm so sorry," I said through my tears. "I'm so sorry I believed everything Mom told me. I'm sorry I never tried to find out the truth." "Don't apologize, sweetheart. You were a child. You trusted the people who were raising you. That's what children are supposed to do." He gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, then settled into the chair beside me rather than behind his desk. Even in his own office, he didn't want there to be barriers between us. "Tell me about your life," he said. "Tell me about Michael, about your job, about your dreams. I want to hear everything from you." So I did. I told him about meeting Michael in college, about our courtship, about my work in marketing and my hopes of maybe starting my own agency someday. I told him about the small apartment we'd just bought and how we were planning to start a family in a few years. He listened to every word, asking thoughtful questions, remembering details from my letters that I'd forgotten I'd written. And slowly, as we talked, I began to understand the scope of what I'd lost and what he'd been carrying alone all these years. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "The wedding vendors. Mom somehow got amazing deals on everything, prices that didn't make sense for the level of service we received. Was that?" He smiled, a sad but proud expression. "You always were smart." "Yes, that was me. Most of the major vendors for your wedding work for companies I own." "So you paid for my wedding?" "I paid for my daughter's happiness." "There's a difference." I leaned back in the chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "How much of my life have you been quietly supporting?" "Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters. I need to understand how wrong I've been about everything." He was quiet for a long moment, then stood and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of his office. He pulled out a thick folder and brought it back to me. "Your college tuition was covered by a scholarship from the Reynolds Foundation. The foundation I established 15 years ago specifically to fund educational opportunities for deserving students. You were the first recipient." I opened the folder and saw copies of scholarship applications, transcripts, recommendation letters. Everything had been processed legitimately, but the selection committee had unknowingly been awarding money to the founder's own daughter. "The house Mom and Marcus live in," I said, remembering something from the letters. "You mentioned refinancing in one of your letters." "Marcus works for me now, has for 15 years. He doesn't know it, of course. When his property management company was failing, I bought it through a subsidiary. He kept his job, kept his salary, never had to know that his comfortable life was possible because his stepdaughter's father was making sure his family stayed stable. The magnitude of it was staggering. You've been taking care of all of us this whole time. I've been taking care of my daughter. Marcus and your mother were just collateral beneficiaries. Dad, I don't know how to make up for 20 years of not knowing any of this." He reached over and took my hand, his fingers warm and steady around mine. "You don't have to make up for anything, Emma. You're here now. You know the truth now. That's enough for me." But it wasn't enough for me. I thought about all the Father's Day cards I'd never sent, all the birthdays he'd spent alone, all the milestones he'd missed, not because he didn't care, but because he'd been systematically excluded from my life. "I want to try again," I said firmly. "I want to build a real relationship with you. I want you to meet Michael properly, as my father, not as some stranger at my wedding. I want you to be part of my life, going forward." His eyes filled with tears again. "I would love that more than anything in the world. But I need to understand something first. Why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you take Mom to court, force visitation, make them let you see me?" His expression grew distant, pained. "Because I was terrified that if I pushed too hard you'd end up hating me even more. Your mother was very good at making it seem like my attempts at contact were disruptive to your happiness. Every time I tried to assert my rights as your father, you seemed to withdraw further. I was afraid that if I forced the issue, I'd lose you completely. So you chose to love me from a distance rather than risk pushing me away. I chose to love you in whatever way you could accept, even if that meant accepting nothing at all. I squeezed his hand tighter. I'm never accepting nothing from you again, Dad. I want everything. I want to know about your life, your work, your hopes, your dreams. I want to introduce you to my friends as my father. I want you to walk me down the aisle at my vow renewal ceremony in 5 years. He laughed through his tears. I would be honored. As we sat there in his office, 25 years of separation beginning to heal, I realized that some love is so strong it survives anything. Distance, time, manipulation, misunderstanding. My father had loved me consistently and quietly for my entire life, and now, finally, I was old enough and wise enough to love him back the way he deserved. 6 months after that first conversation in my father's office, I was sitting across from Patricia in the same coffee shop where we used to meet when I was in college. But this time, the dynamic between us had shifted completely. I was no longer the daughter seeking approval. I was a woman who had finally learned the truth about her childhood. You can't just cut us out of your life, Emma, Patricia said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of wounded authority. We're still your family. Marcus raised you. He loves you. I'm not cutting anyone out, Mom, but I'm also not pretending anymore that the story you told me about my father was true. Patricia stirred her coffee nervously, avoiding my gaze. Over the past 6 months, as I'd grown closer to my father and begun to understand the scope of what had been hidden from me, my relationship with Patricia and Marcus had grown increasingly strained. Your father was never there when you needed him, Emma. Yes, maybe I kept some letters from you, but I was protecting you from being disappointed again and again. You kept everything from me, Mom. Not just some letters. Every letter, every present, every attempt he made to be part of my life. And you never gave him the chance to be there, because you never told him when I needed him. The previous week, I had learned something that crystallized just how deep the deception had gone. When I was 16 and had been hospitalized with appendicitis, my father had called the hospital every day for a week, trying to get information about my condition. Patricia had instructed the staff to tell him nothing, claiming it would upset me to know he was asking about me. He had a right to know his daughter was in the hospital, Mom. You were fine. It was routine surgery. That's not the point, and you know it. Patricia set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. So what happens now? You just embrace him and pretend the last 20 years didn't happen? He's basically a stranger to you, Emma. He's not a stranger. He's my father. And the more time I spend with him, the more I remember who he really is. It was true. In the months since our reunion, memories had been surfacing constantly. My father reading to me before bed, teaching me to ride a bicycle in the park, the way he used to make funny voices when he told stories, the patience he'd shown when I was learning to tie my shoes. All of it had been buried, but not lost. What about Marcus? He walked you down the aisle at your wedding. He paid for your education. Actually, Mom, he didn't pay for my education. Dad did, through a scholarship program that Marcus never knew existed. Patricia's face went pale. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that almost everything I thought I knew about who provided for me growing up was wrong. I had spent the past few months learning about my father's business empire and slowly understanding how many aspects of our family's comfortable life had been possible because of his quiet intervention. It wasn't just the wedding vendors or the college scholarship, the favorable mortgage terms on their house, the excellent insurance coverage Marcus had somehow qualified for despite his company's previous financial struggles, even the country club membership that had seemed like such a stretch at the time but had somehow been approved. Did you know that Marcus works for Dad now? I asked quietly. That's impossible. Marcus owns his own company. Marcus works for a company that Dad bought 15 years ago when it was about to go bankrupt. Dad saved Marcus's career and never told him. The color drained completely from Patricia's face. Emma, that can't be true. It is true, Mom. For 15 years, Marcus's salary has been paid by the man whose family he took over. The stability you praised him for providing? It was possible because my father was ensuring that stability from behind the scenes. Patricia looked around the coffee shop as if she was searching for an escape route. The careful narrative she'd maintained for 25 years was crumbling, and she knew it. I never meant for things to go this far, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But they did go this far. And now I have to figure out how to have a relationship with the man who actually raised me, while also building a relationship with the father who never stopped loving me. The truth was, it wasn't as complicated as I'd feared it might be. Marcus was a good man who had genuinely loved me and done his best to be a father to me. But he wasn't my father, and pretending otherwise had cost me 25 years with the man who was. "Does Marcus know?" Patricia asked. "About the company, about your father?" "Not yet, but he's going to. Dad wants to meet with him next week." I had been present for that conversation between my father and me, watching as he struggled with how to handle the delicate situation of revealing the truth to Marcus without destroying the man's sense of dignity. "I don't want to humiliate him," my father had said. "He's been a good stepfather to you and he didn't know about any of this. But I also think he deserves to know the truth about who's been employing him all these years." The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. My father had decided to offer Marcus a choice. He could continue in his current role with the knowledge of who really owned the company, or he could help my father find a suitable buyer for the property management division and start fresh somewhere else. Either way, Marcus would be treated with respect and given options that protected his financial security. "Emma, please don't let this destroy our family," Patricia pleaded. "I'm not destroying anything, Mom. I'm just finally learning the truth about what our family actually is." As I drove home from that coffee shop meeting, I thought about forgiveness and what it meant to rebuild relationships that had been built on deception. I wasn't angry with Marcus. He had been lied to as much as I had, just in different ways. And while I was hurt by Patricia's choices, I was beginning to understand that she had acted out of fear rather than malice. Fear that sharing me with my father would mean losing some of her own connection to me. That evening, Michael and I had dinner with my father at his house, a beautiful colonial in the suburbs that he'd bought 5 years earlier but had never really made into a home. We spent the evening looking through photo albums he'd kept of my childhood, pictures he'd taken from a distance at school events and soccer games, moments he'd captured without my knowledge because he couldn't bear to miss them entirely. "I was at your high school graduation," he told me as we looked at a photograph of me in my cap and gown. "I sat in the back row and I left before the reception so you wouldn't see me and be upset, but I needed to be there when you walked across that stage." "I wish I had known," I said, leaning against his shoulder the way I used to when I was small. "I wish you had known too, but I'm grateful that you know now." The following week, the meeting with Marcus went better than anyone had expected. My father handled it with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the entire situation, explaining the history without making Marcus feel diminished or manipulated. Marcus, to his credit, took the news with surprising grace. "I always wondered how we managed to turn things around so quickly when the company was failing," Marcus admitted. "The timing of the buyout was almost too good to be true." "You're a good businessman, Marcus," my father replied. "The company succeeded because you ran it well. I just provided the capital." Marcus chose to stay with the company, and over the following months, he and my father developed a respectful working relationship. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was a mature acknowledgement of their shared investment in my happiness. The most profound change, though, was in my relationship with my father. We began having dinner together once a week, sometimes just the two of us, sometimes with Michael. He shared stories about building his business empire, about the lonely years after the divorce, about the small ways he'd found to stay connected to my life. I told him about my dreams of starting my own marketing agency, and he offered not just emotional support, but practical advice from someone who had built a successful business from nothing. 3 months later, when I told him that Michael and I were ready to start trying for a baby, he cried with joy. "I miss so much with you," he said, wiping his eyes. "But maybe I'll get to be there for my grandchildren." "You will be," I promised him. "You'll be the grandfather who shows up for every birthday party and school play and soccer game. You'll be the one they run to when they need someone who believes in them unconditionally." A year after our reunion, my father quietly restructured his business interests. He stepped back from day-to-day operations of several companies, including the ones that had been indirectly supporting Patricia and Marcus's lifestyle. It wasn't vindictive. It was simply a natural evolution as he focused on the relationships and activities that brought him genuine joy. Patricia and Marcus adjusted to a more modest lifestyle without complaint. Marcus took on additional responsibilities at work to compensate for the loss of the indirect subsidies they'd been receiving, and Patricia went back to work part-time at a local real estate office. The transition was challenging, but it was also honest in a way their previous comfort hadn't been. On the second anniversary of my wedding, Michael and I hosted a small dinner party. My father was there, of course, along with Patricia and Marcus. It was the first time we'd all been in the same room since the wedding, but the dynamic was completely different. There was no pretense, no hidden resentments, no careful navigation around old wounds. During dessert, Marcus raised his glass. "I want to toast David," he said, surprising everyone at the table. "For 25 years, you put Emma's happiness above your own pride, and that takes a kind of strength I'm not sure I could have managed. Thank you for trusting me to help raise an incredible woman, and thank you for welcoming me into her life now that she has room for both of us." My father raised his own glass, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for loving her when I couldn't be there to do it myself." As I watched the two men who had shaped my life acknowledge each other with respect and genuine gratitude, I realized that this was what victory looked like. Not revenge, not humiliation, not the destruction of old relationships, but the careful, patient construction of new ones built on truth instead of fear. My father had won the long game not by fighting, but by loving consistently and unconditionally, until love found a way to break through the barriers that had been built around it. He had taught me that sometimes the greatest strength is in waiting, in trusting that truth will eventually surface, in believing that love is more powerful than manipulation. That night, as Michael and I cleaned up after our guests had gone home, I thought about the child we were trying to conceive and the grandfather who would be there to welcome that baby into the world. My father would never get back the 25 years we'd lost, but he would have all the years ahead of us. And somehow, that felt like the most perfect justice of all. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.